So today we are going to be talking about the story of David and Goliath. The other week, my Sunday school class watched a video presentation about this story by a guy named Malcolm Gladwell. He's a writer, and I was so captured by what he had to say about the story that I wanted to share some of that with you today. As a side note, I also ended up getting the book David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. If you ever want to check it out, it's a pretty good story. So let's just jump into the scripture reading, and then we're going to kind of work our way through it. This reading comes from 1 Samuel 17, 32 to 37. And as the background of the story, you probably are familiar with it. Besides Noah's Ark, this is one of the most familiar stories of the Bible, but it's the story of David and Goliath. David is just in this passage a young shepherd boy bringing food to his older brothers, and the army is gathered there, and this is what it says. David says to Saul, Saul is the king of Israel at this time, the first king. David says to Saul, in reference to Goliath, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight him. You're just a boy. He's been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. So your servant has killed lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. He's defied the armies of the living God." Well, David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." In other words, what Saul is really saying to David is, "You're crazy, you don't stand a chance, but it's you and not me, go ahead." Now, this is a really intriguing story when you dig into it. And I want us to think about this morning, why is this story in the Bible? Why was it so special that they wanted to be sure to include it? And how do we apply the story of David and Goliath to our lives today? Now, the history of the context of the battle is like this. The Israelites were camped out on a mountain, and they were under the leadership of King Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel. And in order to expand their kingdom, they needed to move down the mountain and beyond their borders. But at the bottom of the mountain, in a meadow, were the Philistines. The Philistines also wanted to expand their kingdom. But in order to expand their kingdom, they had to move up the mountain and battle the Israelites. So you can see the problem here. Both armies are well situated, but neither side wants to face the other by either going down the mountain or going up the mountain, because to do so would be a certain wish of death. And so for 40 days, they are just camped out there. The Israelites are up high, the Philistines are down low. A battle is looming, but no one wants to be the first to make the move. So for 40 days and 40 nights, and that is, of course, a biblical number there, Goliath, on behalf of the Philistines, went out into the meadow. Now, Goliath was tall, especially in the ancient world. Scholars think he was somewhere between 6'7" and 6'9". And he would go out to the middle of the meadow, and he would call up to the mountains, and he would say, "If any of you Israelites are brave enough to fight me, come on down the hill and bring it on." Nobody wants to. What Goliath was doing is he was supporting this ancient kind of practice of war. And that is that when both sides knew that a huge loss would be inevitable, They would send the strongest person from each side of their military to duel it out with the other person. And that way, there wasn't a large casualty, and whoever won the fight would win on behalf of the entire military. So Goliath goes out into the meadow, and he would have been covered in armor and bronze, about 100 pounds worth. And he had with him 3 different swords, or pieces of weapon, a javelin, a sword, a short spear. And every day for 40 days, at morning and at night, and the timing is specific about that because that is when the Israelites would have been saying their prayers. So every time during prayer time, Goliath would go out to the meadow and say, "One of you come down here and challenge me." No one wants to take on the challenge. Who would want to walk down a mountain and fight a giant covered in bronze armor? Well, here comes David. He's taking the food to his older brothers who have been camped out there for the last 40 days, and David just takes care of the sheep. He's a shepherd boy, and he hears Goliath utter this, and David says to Saul, "I'll solve this problem for you." Saul, of course, does not think this is a good idea, but he doesn't do much to dissuade him. And there's, if you're reading this story and you know a little bit about the history of Israel, there's a little bit of like insider jabs there because Saul is supposed to be this great king of Israel and he's too afraid to go fight Goliath, so he sends David, the boy who's taking care of the shepherds. But anyway, David goes down the hill and he fights Goliath, and we know how the story goes, right? He uses a sling to launch a stone and it hits Goliath in the middle of the head. It's really a very vicious, gruesome story. Goliath falls down, he's stunned. David takes his sword and cuts off his head and hands it up, and life goes on. Well, life doesn't go on for Goliath, but the story goes on. Now, here's what we've been taught to believe about the story, right? We have been taught to believe that the story of David and Goliath is a metaphor for beating incredible odds in our lives, right? We've been taught to believe that David is the underdog and Goliath is the giant, and it's a metaphor for doing something that seems almost impossible. But this morning, what Gladwell said is, I want to say that everything we've been taught about that story, about David as being the underdog, is wrong. Let me tell you why. First, there is the assumption of power. Saul doesn't believe that David stood a chance because David is small and Goliath is large. Saul sees power only in its physical size. Now, David doesn't see power in that way. David thinks about how to solve problems with creativity. David has with him his sling. Now, modern day research has shown that a stone launched from a sling has a tremendous force, equivalent to the force of a bullet being shot from a pistol. And so David knows that he can use the sling to address the size of Goliath. Now, you can think about it in modern day terms like this, and Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his book. There's a 12-year-old girls basketball team in California. The coach is a software genius tech guy from India who's never played a day of basketball in his life. Well, his daughter's on the elementary basketball team, and no one wants to volunteer to coach, so he decides, well, I can do it, no problem. I'm a smart guy. Well, he gets the team together for the first time, and it becomes quickly apparent that no one the coach or the players has any skill with basketball, with dribbling or shooting. And so the coach, Techware Giant, goes back home and he thinks this over and he thinks to himself, can I teach this young group of girls how to catch the ball, pass the ball, dribble the ball, shoot the ball, and be competitive in a short elementary school season and win basketball games? And the answer is no. So at first, there is the assumption that because the girls don't know how to play basketball, they're not going to win any basketball games. But he starts to think about it from a different perspective. And all of a sudden, he discovers that he can teach these 12-year-old girls how to win every single basketball game, and they go on to be the champions in their league. And it's not from passing and dribbling and shooting and everything else. Do you know what it is? He teaches these 12-year-olds how to do full court defensive press. The other teams aren't used to it. And so when they do a full court press, they recover the ball very quickly and they're close to the basket. And so eventually they make in 1 or 2 shots a game. Now, they don't have any high-scoring games. I think I read that the entire season, the highest-scoring game was 12 points. But in most of the games, they limited their opponents to 0 points. And they would win by 4 points or 6 points. And they did that because they addressed the problem from a creative angle. All right. So there's the assumption of power and how to address it. The second assumption is that when Goliath tells David to come to him, Goliath thinks that David is going to fight him with the unwritten rules of battle. But when David walks forth with the sling, David's not thinking that at all. And there's 2 other things that take place, and this has to go back with this idea of power. Goliath says to David, "Why are you carrying 2 sticks and coming at me?" Well, the sling was only 1 stick. And all of a sudden it becomes clear that Goliath not only couldn't see well, that's why he needed to have hand-to-hand combat, but also he couldn't walk well. It says that when Goliath was led out to the meadow, he had someone walking with him, an assistant. Well, now scholars believe, this is kind of generally agreed upon, that Goliath suffered from an improbable or unusual growth hormone. And I have the word of it. I don't know how to pronounce it. Acromegaly. Acromegaly. I don't know how you say that. But anyway, it caused him to grow big and not be able to see well. And so all of a sudden you think of Goliath as this having this unusual power, but what makes him appear so strong is actually a sign of weakness. And then David has this belief in the Spirit and the power of God. And this is where the text gets challenging for me because in my mind, I say, well, okay, so David had this belief in the power and the Spirit of God, and so is that saying that God wants you to go down and chop off the head of someone who is opposite of you, and then you get in all sorts of terrorists and caliphate and all, whatever. That goes down a bad road, right? At least in my mind. Here's what I think it says. I think that the armor of God or the Spirit of God or the power of God is with those who are feeling marginalized or oppressed or facing down some sort of giant in their life. That's the way that I understand it. And then I think about the giants in life. And man, I have to tell you, I had a hard time this morning when we were first singing those songs. I didn't know that you guys are going to be wearing the pink shirts there for Kathy. And I think about Kathy and her family and the giants they're facing in life. And I think about Sherry and Kevin and the battles that David's facing in life. And I mean, there are just some hard battles in life, right? There are giants that we face. And it can be people, it can also be cancer, it could be some other disease, it could be a change in jobs, location, an understanding of who you are, whatever it is. But there are giants that we face every single day. And they can look to be so imposing and so crushing. And how we approach it, we don't always come out in ways that we think is victorious. But how we approach those battles, it says so much about who we are and who God is. David had the strength to face the giants in his life head on. I think that's such a story of faith. Sometimes you face whatever you experience head on only because you know that God is with you. Otherwise, it just would not be possible. And so in the very end, David does win, right? He defeats Goliath, the Philistines are defeated, the Israelites live to see another day. David eventually becomes king. He faces down the fear that paralyzed so many others. For me, it's a story not about necessarily life or death, but it's a story about facing your fear or not facing your fear. When you're standing on that hilltop, whether it's literally or metaphorically, and you're looking down at whatever is facing you, you could stay there for a long time. And that's what the Israelites did under King Saul. They just stayed there and they waited. Or you can face it head on, knowing that what you accomplish might not always be the outcome that you want, but that you do so because you walk with God. That's the promise that God gives. Wherever you go, I go with you. That's what God says. May we all have that power, that strength, and that belief. Through Christ we say together, amen.